I'm using Pigeonhole to categorize some of your questions from the audience, so please feel free to send that back up to me. There were a number about going deeper on definitions of public-private partnerships, partly definitions, partly examples. So I'll use the academic fact that I have the microphone, I guess, to give some frameworks. Then I'll ask the panel for some examples of successful PPPs. As I've studied this around the world, a lot of people talk about public-private partnerships. Most of the talk is either governments with no money or vendors trying to sell something, in my view. The sweet spot is in between, where you have a need and something that matches. And ultimately, the PPP success in the broad framing comes down to repayment. It works if you get repaid. If there's not a tariff that repays, for example, at an airport or a power plant, then there are two other T's that Usha Ramanari talked about on Saturday in the mayor's conference. You can repay the public-private partnership through tariffs, or through taxes, or through transfers. Those are really the three ways you can pay for these kind of things. We may have some best practices in that regard. The last piece that I've seen is that conceptually, a PPP is really simple. If you can presume four things. If you can presume a source of repayment, if you can presume competence on all sides, if you can presume good intent on both sides, then you can get a long way. You can't always presume any of those things around repayment stream, competence, good intent, and that's where things get interesting in the PPP space. So with that pure academic, alliterative, heavy thought, Patrick, let me turn to you. A question came up saying, ULI is a global leader in responsible use of land through encouraging both public and private sectors. Can you share a few best practices of successful PPPs?
Sure. I think that the most effective PPPs that I've seen have a clear economic rationale. And I think that needs to be distinguished from a clear real estate development rationale. They're two different things. And this speaks to the public sector underwriting of the deal. You know, understanding clearly the objectives from an economic development standpoint that the public sector is bringing to the project is critical. And too often we have seen public-private partnerships that are simply predicated on a real estate development project and don't really have an underlying link to the public sector's economic development strategy. The project that we're sitting in, I think, is a good example of a project that has a clear economic rationale. The government of Singapore had a fundamental strategic objective with respect to economic diversification and attracting visitors from outside the region who would grow the economic base of Singapore, and therefore executed it in this particular fashion. That's not always the case, and it's particularly true in our experience in the United States, where local governments are very fragmented, and they compete with one another to recruit development. It's important to recruit development because that drives property tax receipts up at the local government level. And so you get jurisdictions next door to each other competing for the new retail center or the new office park or whatever it might be. Those are simply real estate projects, and they don't really have an objective toward growing the economy of the region. And there's a lot of reasons that governments do that. But the most successful projects that we've seen grow the economic base. One quick example, and this is yet to be realized, but it's in the early stages, and that's in New York City. You know, I'm fond of saying that when we think about the public and private partners, it's often effective when the roles are slightly reversed. That is, the public sector has a return on investment, an ROI, bottom line orientation, and a sense of urgency, and the private side has a long-term view and a sense of what creates durable value. It's a bit of a twist, but I like to think that New York City under Mayor Bloomberg has that kind of business-like near-term sense of urgency orientation. So they entered into a public-private partnership recently to create a new science and technical university on publicly owned land within the city of New York, and they invited about 17 teams to participate in the negotiations and the bidding, and they finally selected a consortium of Technion Institute from Israel and Cornell University to do this. Now, this was important because it advanced a particular strategic objective of the city of New York to develop its brain power businesses to complement its traditional strengths in publishing and finance and the like. And it outlined a very clear program, a very clear set of expectations to the private bidders, and then let the market do the work to come up with the best solution. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing in terms of best practices, John.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Goh to follow up on that a little bit, sort of in two regards, both in terms of creating value, because you talked about not just the initial real estate, but creating value. But the questions are kind of abstract. One is around following up on the Singapore experience or the New York experience, where you have very strong, transparent, visible, capable leadership. The second is also a reflection of New York, Singapore, and some other cities around density, around compactness. And even though you aren't necessarily principals in projects, I'm sure that somewhere in your system, you're underwriting the risk, your perception of some measure of leadership. I don't know if you have a scale that way, and also some level of compactness, density, how much value will be created. Can you share some comments about how you think about that in the investment context?
Yes, the way we would think about it is what is current and what is the best guess as to what would be the outcome on an ongoing basis. So as Patrick has mentioned, and as some of the other speakers have mentioned, the leadership dimension is important. Unfortunately, in most cities, leaderships of the cities and of the state changes from time to time. So that aspect is extremely difficult to predict. But nevertheless, we look at track record as a backward-looking indicator as to what one could sort of therefore think about as future outcomes. So we do look at those, and those are extremely important. And I think in the era moving ahead, regulatory risk is probably one of the larger risks for real estate investment that tends to be chunky and that tends to be long-term. Having said that, while we think of things in those manner, again, in any investment of this nature, it is a confluence of different factors. And so the question, therefore, is if you have some of those risks, are you then adequately compensated in the other areas? And this is where it's important. So the other areas would be, is there a high enough density? Is the business environment, the rules pertaining to business favorable? Is the infrastructure good? And at the end of the day, the question really, I think, is what do governments want to achieve? If they want a thriving city, a growing city, then the game, in my view, is to make sure that the environment is as easy as possible for investors, for businesses to come do business and to invest in the city, be it real estate or anything else, right? Because that would then allow investors to price it with the least risk premium, which ultimately will be good for the city. And for investors, really, we would rather not deal with all the kind of risks that the rest of the panel has talked about.
I'm really interested in your comment about what do the governments want to achieve. And it follows on the earlier session about smart cities, where there were questions about integration and, gee, does your vendor solution go integrated all the way from the giant legacy mainframes to everybody's handheld to somebody's SMS system? And the response was, what are you trying to do? What's the problem? And this question of what governments want to achieve is quite interesting to think about in our context, because They might want to achieve long-term growth. They might want to clean up one area of a city. They might really have to get clean water to people first. There are a number of different things. They might have to get reelected. They might not. And this issue of thinking about what's trying to be accomplished is quite a nice way for people like us to emerge and not just think about the tools, but to think about where we're actually trying to go. That also leads pretty well, Patrick, into what you mentioned before. And I'm going to put a little twist on the leadership kind of question. It's pretty easy for people like us to wring our hands and to say, all we need is better leadership, crisis of leadership. I'm an American. We're not going to necessarily go there. But to me, it also seems that business leaders sometimes can provide longer term, longer view direction and leadership. And I'm not sure if that's what you're going to talk about, Patrick, but you asked me to ask you about leadership, so go ahead.
Well, no, I think that is the point. I think that the traditional kind of view is that the government takes the long view, the big picture view, and that the private side of the deal is much more bottom line focused and short term in their thinking. But again, I think that if you look at the successful public-private partnerships around the world, you get these roles slightly reversed. And you mentioned in passing a moment ago, John, that one objective of the public sector might be to be reelected. And that can be a really important driver in public-private partnerships. Mayors like to cut ribbons before the term ends, and real estate is a long-term proposition, real estate development. So I do think that we need to kind of continue the call for effective leadership in public-private partnerships. One area that we've seen that is interesting is the emergence of a third leg. We have the public sector and the private sector represented by the investors and developers. Increasingly, we're seeing major, what we're calling anchor institutions in cities play an important role in leadership. Most prominently, this includes universities. These kinds of institutions are deeply rooted in these cities. They're not going anywhere. They're thinking long term. They are international increasingly in their perspective, so they're not as parochial as some of the traditional business leadership. And oftentimes we're seeing really effective kind of three-party leaders emerge: private sector business leaders, the government, and these institutional leaders working together to advance these kinds of projects.
So, Mr. Choo, can I ask you a follow-up about this sort of third way? Because I see that you are the Singapore's non-resident ambassador to Brazil. This sounds to me like it's potentially a neither business nor government kind of leadership role. Do I understand this correctly? And what are your key performance indicators in your job as a non-resident ambassador to Brazil?
No, Singapore is a small country, and we don't have embassies all over the world. So we have a system whereby government appoints business people and prominent academicians or professionals to be ambassadors, non-resident ambassadors in different countries. And they call upon me to go to do it in Brazil because we have a presence there, and I go to Brazil in a regular way, even though Brazil is quite far away from Singapore. You spend virtually, I think, 25, 30 hours to get there. And the way I look at it is that as a role of a non-ambassador, I think the key is to foster the relationship between the people level, business level, and the government level. And I think that is the reason why I think over the many years, I think Brazil and Singapore the relationship has strengthened in many ways because of mutual need and mutual interest. And we see that going forward, that role doesn't conflict with my role in Keppel, because in Keppel we are creating jobs in Brazil. We employ something like 6,000 Brazilians in our shipyards. And we see that going forward, Brazil benefit also from the relationship with Singapore, and Singapore benefit from the relationship with Singapore. We are the biggest, I think Brazil provide us with the biggest share of our frozen chicken import, for example. It's very far away, but they provide competitive meat imports for Singapore. And I think that that's how the Singapore government kind of functions in this respect.
Now, I think most of your work is in Rio State, is that right?
Okay, I think when I'm to go there as an official representation for Singapore, I'll go to Sao Paulo because the Singapore Airlines fly to Sao Paulo. Then I'll go to Brasilia, then go to Rio, then maybe go to Curitiba or some other capitals.
So let me ask Mr. Aparecido if make a comment about the best ways to work together with a non-resident ambassador, with someone like Mr. Choo, who's here from Singapore. What are the ways in which the Singapore lessons and models can be brought to help the people of a huge state like Sao Paulo?
The experience is interesting. There is a process of urbanization and cleaning the rivers in the area of the residency and housing, which is similar to the challenges that we face in Brazil and in São Paulo. Investors and ambassadors like Mr. Suf invest in Brazil and in São Paulo because initially the return in business in Brazil is extremely positive. Secondly, Brazil and São Paulo has a scale. The numbers that we have commented here, and in the same way that he has mentioned, we had a Brazilian economy that is extremely stable at the moment. We have a juridic and a law system that provides extreme security for investors, both external and internal, for their investments. And finally, we have a government that had elections 4 years ago is still creating instruments in the state in order for these strategic investments in terms of volume and volume and the time, and that they will not suffer, to ensure they won't suffer any type of discontinuity. This is fundamental, and it attracts in this external investors. The scenario that we have today, mainly in São Paulo, is extremely positive in terms of economy, safety, and in terms of the return that investors may obtain. And in the same way, the business is also established in a way in Brazil. São Paulo is one of the main exporters of planes, for example. We have an aeronautical industry that is extremely competitive, and we have. But the most important point is concretely is that we created governmental tools, strategic planning that do not suffer discontinuity throughout the time, and that's what attracts investors to our country.
Thank you. So that ties very much into what Mr. Goh said about the leadership as well. Now, Mr. Choo, it sounds like you're missing an opportunity because from Brazil you're buying frozen chickens. You could be buying entire airplanes. That might be something else to work on.
Embraer has set up a center
Can't hear you.
in Singapore. Actually, the Brazilian aircraft manufacturer Embraer have set up a center in Singapore where they train crews and people for the aircraft, and in fact they are setting up a manufacturing center in China too.
Excellent, thank you. I want to comment on one more of the pigeonhole questions, and then we'll take questions from the floor. Evidently there are some technology-averse people in that, although you can tell that the hot air sensor has come on and they're moving a lot of cold air in the room. One of the questions is sort of around definitions and frameworks in PPPs and in public-private partnerships, and I'll give sort of an academic answer to that, then we can start taking questions from the floor. One of them is that in infrastructure kind of projects, there are multiple ways to think about who performs what in the PPP, ranging from a purely privatized thing, like an entire electrical power plant, where all the capital spending is by the private operator, all the operating costs are by the private operator, and all the tariff risk is borne by the private operator, You can also imagine a situation maybe in a water system where the capital cost initially is done by the government because it's hard to repay in water, but the private operator might take the tariff responsibility and the operating cost responsibility. You can also imagine in water or roads a situation where the government does the initial capital investment, the government does the ongoing maintenance investment, the government takes the tariff risk, but they hire the privatizer for operating points of view to run the toll road or run the water system. Also a common way to do PPP. And the last one is to hire a privatizer just for the administrative piece. So the government might own the asset, the government might take the tariff risk in the asset, but the government might say, let's outsource all the billing, all the collections, all the cleaning, those kind of things. So I found it very useful to think about that kind of framework rather than just talk about a generic thing like a privatized asset. The second, then we'll take questions from the floors, is around the identification and allocation of risk. So in PPP projects, there's often a project level risk, and there's also country level risk, which might be the markets or exchange rates or something like that. Some of these risks can be controlled, some of them you cannot control. So people in the classic sense will go out and argue about each of those. So a project risk that can be controlled is something like construction cost. So that contractually might be borne by the privatizer. A country risk that cannot be controlled is something like foreign exchange rate. So either somebody hedges that, or the privatizer bears it, or they dish that off to the government. So you can think of the different levels of assets to be privatized in that kind of bucket. You can also think of risk as a 2x2, as a project risk, country risk, what can I control, what can I not control, and you can walk through and hedge each of those. But we didn't come here for academic talk about those things. So I think I've answered the questions from Pigeonhole. Are there questions from the floor? So I'd like you to walk to the microphone, tell us who you are, and ask your question. It's in the back of the row there, and I'm sure if we talk about the American elections, we can get everybody to queue up behind the microphone and ask questions, but Patrick and I won't take them.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Narendra Nair. I'm chairman of Bombay First. If I see your title of your today's discussion was going to be reinventing and sustaining cities, we spent a lot of time on talking about public-private partnership of infrastructure. I would like to submit as another model of public-private partnership, getting the citizens involved in trying to act as a catalyst for the mayors and for the administration, for the government to do something. And I'm giving this our own example in Bombay. We established what we call a Bombay First, a truly public-private partnership for the regeneration of the city. And we're working with the government, and act as a catalyst, looking at cross-section of areas, and I think this is another area which I think could play a very important part for regeneration of the cities here.
Thank you. May I direct that question to Mr. Aparecido? So the question is about a bottom-up engagement of the people in decisions about sustaining cities, and clearly that's your background is with people. I also think it was interesting, asked by somebody from Mumbai, because India doesn't really have a strong mayor system. It has a strong state system, so the chief minister is more in charge, and there isn't really a Bloomberg kind of figure in that regard. But that's very much what you have done in Sao Paulo in terms of having a metropolitan area come together. So perhaps, Mr. Aparecido, you can talk a little bit about involving the people, the individual citizens, in the decisions about the state, and also some of the things you've learned about getting all these different mayors to work together, and that might be responsive to the excellent question from India.
Participation of the citizens in the building and of solutions, and also it's a very important. In São Paulo, there are 39 districts, 39 cities. Around 22 million inhabitants. It is the third biggest city in the planet after Tokyo and New Delhi. Today, these issues are we're not able to solve issues in a isolated way. We cannot fight, like for example, floods in a certain district without engaging the neighboring districts. So we create this government district instrument so that there can be a decision-making process made with the citizens, so that the best decision can be taken and that the population can have a big role in these decisions. We also have a partnership between the state and the public partnership in relation to health, to hospitals. So the state builds the hospital, and the citizens manage the hospital. For us, it's very important in terms of efficiency. That can be found in the health department. The population participates intensely in this mechanism. This is an important mechanism. Society must always accompany this process because it's a way to enhance efficiency with the population's participation. You also mentioned partnerships between the public and the private, in which the state builds MRT lines, and then the people will operate these lines. The private initiative will not manage the infrastructure. So there are several different mechanisms in which we can build these partnerships. But the participation of society through the parliament or grassroots organizations is fundamental to chase this efficiency and to make sure that there is in order for the citizens to gain from the situation.
Thank you. So, Patrick, let me ask you a follow-up, sort of a global perspective around this. Yesterday, Minister Kamal Nath was talking about India as being the biggest democracy and the most rowdy democracy. So one can imagine situations where participation of the people isn't necessarily moving everybody in the same direction. One can also imagine situations where participation of the people is a very powerful force where developers' government are aligned. Can you give us some examples of some places where you've seen that work or not in ULI, and how did it get accomplished?
Yeah, it's a challenge because of the open-ended nature of the potentially open-ended nature of the public participation, or the process by which consensus is ultimately achieved. Oftentimes, the government essentially, if they're progressive and enlightened, leads the public through some sort of process to arrive at a defensible and reasonably concrete vision for a particular project or initiative, and then the developer gets involved to implement and execute. What we've seen more increasingly lately is the developer playing a much more instrumental role in achieving that consensus in that planning. The challenge for the developer, of course, is managing the cost and time associated with that process, and it's not uncommon for projects to get sidetracked or to ultimately not be achieved because of that lack of consensus or the open-ended nature of that process, and it's expensive and time-consuming. But I think when the government and the developer work closely together within some kind of finite or bounded process with a limit on the time and cost, that can be a really effective way to do that. But it's a rare developer. It's a relatively short list of developers who are willing to go through that kind of a process. But I think that's where you get the optimal results.
So I want to make a comment about that, and then I'll ask each person to make sort of a closing thought for a few sentences about a solution. So the question was a very direct question about how do we advance cities using the tools of private investment. But I want to make a comment about the involvement of the people from something that Carla Razzi said earlier in the Smart Cities session, where now you have so much connectivity, so much awareness, so much tweeting, so much pigeonholing, that there can be extremely direct involvement, but it very much changes the relationship between the citizenship and the people who are trying to move in one steady, consistent direction. And there aren't best practices in this regard. This is up in the air. It's what Carla Razzi said was the big question, is about top-down development or bottom-up development. So in a sense, the gentleman's question is exactly the core question that we don't know the answer around how that participation will be engaged and coordinated or not. So let me start from Mark and just say in our last little bit, the topic here is about private investment towards sustainable and livable cities. And we are supposed to be the solution panel because we're the money panel. A good rule of thumb, a good something observed, a good best practice around how to accomplish these things as finance types?
Yeah, I think there's a few levels that you can look at it. At the asset level, which is predominantly what we've been talking about today. PPPs around the world can be very politically, quite significant issues, particularly when it's a user pay type system. So, in a mature market particularly, that it tends to get a bit more sort of emotive. I think, in emerging sort of market cities, there are additional challenges. Something I just wanted to touch on, which I think is a different way of thinking of it, is a public sort of private partnership in a broader context. And because we're in Singapore, I wanted to bring Singapore into it. Singapore started off as an emerging city not so long ago and rapidly turned into a mature market city, probably in record time. I think one way Singapore looked at the public-private approach was to create its own enterprises. Create its own enterprises, seed it with public money, but then bring on private money. The creation of a capital land, a keppel land, a maple tree, where it is essentially a public-private partnership where a public enterprise slowly evolves into a commercial enterprise and is sort of homegrown. So I think, that model in Singapore, worked particularly well. Also got the SOEs in China working on the same sort of model to some degree, and it's a slow transition where it starts off as government, it's the public-private sort of co-investment, you could say. I know the subject today was more on, at the asset level, but I just wanted to put a different spin on it because I think that's particularly important in emerging markets, where government sponsorship and giving people licenses to operate and the mandate to operate, can be done in different ways, bringing private sector capital.
Great. Thank you. That must be a signal. Maybe the fireworks are happening. Is it 8, 9:30, or 11? No, it's not. It's not the fog show outside. Mr. Aparecido, to conclude, one takeaway around how to use this, maybe fewer, around how to use private sector to bring these benefits to the public.
Thank you. First, I think that if we could summarize democracy and social fairness as the most important scenario that give us this guarantee and the governance and the protagonism by the state, the public power in the meaning of its own definition of what is the strategies for the development in the social areas, and finding new ways to invest and to finance the big things that will bring to the citizen good quality of life. And also the PPP is, in our specific case of São Paulo, is in the state of São Paulo, a very important mechanism that will duplicate the public investment in a way that it will grow further in the solution of these strategic plans. Without any doubt, we can only reach this level of investment and infrastructure faster as we need today in terms of world and particularly in terms of Brazil and São Paulo. We can only achieve this if we are very clear and transparent regarding to investment, putting together the public and the private investments.
Great, thank you. Patrick.
John, I'd say two things. One would be to create ongoing mechanisms or forums for a constructive dialogue between the public and private sectors in these jurisdictions. so that there's an atmosphere of trust that emerges over a period of time. And the other essential ingredient will be an enlightened public that understands the relationship and the beneficial and symbiotic relationship between the public and private.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Choo, a final thought, takeaways in this regard.
I think the government must set out the ground rules, do the master plan, and parts of the master plan can be carried out by the private sector, so that there's a clear ground rules and clear outcome that is required by the government as well as by the people.
Thank you. And Mr. Goh, the last word around a takeaway on the topic of how private investment can help the public realm.
Yes, the great thing about going last in a panel like that is I can say I agree with all the rest. The tough thing really is it's really tough to find anything else to say. But I'll just end with this, and that is that a lot has been said that for the private sector, the focus is always on the bottom line, and that's the issue. But I actually think that it's somewhat different, although the objectives of the public sector and the private sector can be different. But because of this virtuous cycle of return and growth, there can be a middle path that the public sector and the private sector can mutually build on that would actually lead to a very favorable outcome. And if you look at successful partnership between public and private sector, all of them have managed to basically stay on this path. And I echo Patrick's view that dialogue is what needs to happen in order to get more and more of these projects on this middle path.
Well, thank you. Well, there's no question that there are many, many people moving to cities. There's no question that there's a shortage of resources. There's little question that most governments are going to need help to accomplish things. Therefore, private capital has to be engaged in ways that works for the private sector, but mostly works for the people. And it's been a great pleasure for me to learn from our 5 panelists and to learn from all of you. So please join me in thanking our panelists today.